Hi, everyone. My name is Yvette Bunsel. I'm Palestinian American. Here we have my dear friend and Jewish author of two books on Israel Palestine. The latest one is called Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity Essays on the Tragedy of Israel Palestine. Rich Forer. For the first 58 years of Rich's life, he defended Israel from any criticism. But through research, self reflection, and spiritual grace, he discovered his common humanity with all people. We're going to discuss some little known facts about Hamas in this video, and we're also going to discuss what Rich refers to in the article as the need to be right and how that is more important than peace. The reference article is linked below. Welcome, Rich.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Good.
So first, we hear some common ideas about Hamas in the media. The two ideas are Hamas wants to obliterate Israel, and the second is Hamas refuses to accept the state of Israel. Therefore, peace is impossible. So, Rich, what has your research revealed?
Well, first of all, Hamas did in their previous charter say that they wanted to, quote, obliterate Israel, and they have always refused to recognize Israel. I want to mention that how can Hamas, first of all, I just want to mention a practical thing. How can Hamas recognize Israel if they don't know what Israel's borders are? What Israel would they be recognizing? Israel has never defined its borders. And the reason it has not is because it's constantly gobbling up more and more of Palestinian territory. Okay, so that's number one. But secondly, in 2017, Hamas published a document in which they deleted any reference to obliterating Israel and in which they offered a peace with Israel. It was a 42-page document, and they offered a formula of national consensus for the establishment of a Palestinian state along the 1967 border, the green line, really, that separates the West Bank from Israel. And Hamas has actually been willing to make peace at least since 2008. And this is well documented. And like, for example, Shin Bet is the Israeli security agency. It's the main internal organization like the FBI. And in 2008, Yuval Diskin, who was the head of Shin Bet at the time, said, number one, that Hamas was willing to accept a long-term ceasefire on the 1967 borders. Later in the same year, the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College stated that Hamas has accepted the notion of a limited area of an envisioned Palestinian state and therefore would recognize Israel in a de facto manner. And then Hamas, in the beginning of 2009, Hamas sent President Obama, a letter committing itself to a just resolution of the conflict in harmony with International Court of Justice, the United Nations General Assembly, and human rights organizations. Now, they did not say they would recognize Israel, but neither did Jordan or Egypt before they made peace with Israel. And Israel has never recognized the right of the Palestinian people to a state. So what we see here is it's always Israel that has to be in control. Everything has to cater to Israel. Israel doesn't have to recognize the Palestinian people or their right to a state, but the Palestinian people have to recognize Israel. Israel can continually ethnically cleanse Palestinians and, let's face it, obliterate them like they're doing right now in Gaza. And Israel has always wanted to ethnically cleanse them from the days with Theodore Herzl in the late 1890s. Israel has always been willing to sacrifice the lives of Palestinians. All you have to do is read the rhetoric of dozens of their leaders and see what they're doing. And yet the onus is always placed on the Palestinians. When in human history has the victim had to account for its behavior and the perpetrator has always been treated as the victim? This is really outrageous. But the main point is that Hamas is willing to make peace, but Israel doesn't want to make peace. And so what Israel does, up till now, Israel has supported Hamas. For example, and I say this in my article, but in 2020, Benjamin Netanyahu, as prime minister, was very worried that Qatar was going to cut off the aid it was providing to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Because Qatar had made overtures to the fact that they were about to end it. So what Netanyahu did was he sent the head of Mossad and he sent a former Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense, to Qatar to talk the Qataris into continuing to pay to give their aid to Hamas, which Qatar did. That money that they would give Hamas was used to pay civil servant salaries. It was used to support indigent families, and it was used for buying fuel and other things because of the blockade that Israel has held over Gaza for 17 years. So it's very unfair to paint Hamas as just a pure evil monster when Israel, number one, keeps them and has kept them in power. And the reason they've kept them in power, as Netanyahu himself said, is because they want to maintain the split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So when Netanyahu sent his missionaries over to Qatar, it was against the objections of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. So Israel wants to maintain the split. The Palestinian Authority would like not to maintain the split, but the split gives Netanyahu and Israel a good excuse for saying we can't make peace. How can we make peace when there's such a split between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza? It's a total fabricated distortion and excuse to avoid making peace without telling the United States that we just don't want to make peace. They're making it sound like they want to make peace, but they can't. And unfortunately, every American administration is unbelievably gullible and extremely lacking in knowledge. I am just amazed at the ignorance of Anthony Blinken and, of course, Joe Biden. Biden doesn't know anything. He's just a schmoozer, to use a Yiddish term. He just likes to get along with people, but he doesn't know anything about the history. But he relies on his Secretary of State to fill him in on the history, and the Secretary of State has all the resources anyone could have and experts to consult with, so he knows the history. And yet he's not providing the president with the correct history, or if he is, the president isn't listening.
Yeah, those are some lesser known facts about Hamas and how they wrote a letter to Obama and how they would like to move forward for peace. And
right. And Jimmy Carter has talked about that, how Hamas would make peace subject to the will of the Palestinian people. Jimmy Carter wrote about that in 2009. So there's ample evidence that there could be peace. Hamas does not want to live in a world where their members and the people that they're responsible for, the citizens of Gaza, are being slaughtered. That Hamas does not want that. They are not monsters, but Israel projects images of Nazis onto Palestinians. And that is one of the major reasons why there is no peace. Because Israel would rather, what do you do when you think someone wants to kill you? What is the safest thing? What is the safest outcome that you could possibly have in relationship to a group of people that want to kill you? Exterminate them, get rid of them, so you don't have to think about them, so you don't have to go to night worried that they may come into your home and kill you or kill your loved ones. That is really behind Israel's behavior. They want as much of the land with as few of the people as possible on that land for themselves.
What do you think their current objective is in Gaza? Because as we see, they couldn't have maintained Gaza and Israel, the relationship and the blockade couldn't have been sustained forever. So what's the goal in Gaza now?
Well, Israel has always had a goal for decades of pushing the Palestinians into the Sinai Desert of Egypt. So we know now that Israel has offered, well, I've seen a couple of different proposals. I saw one proposal if Israel would pay off Egypt's entire debt to I think the to one of the organizations that they borrow money from. Yeah, the International Monetary Fund. I think that's what it is. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of $900 million. But then I also saw that Israel was willing to give Egypt $4 to $5 billion. I don't know whether that would all come from Israel or whether the United States would chip in, but that's another proposal. However, the leader, Sisi, the leader of Egypt, does not want 2 million Gazans living in Egypt in the Sinai Desert from where they could launch raids into Israel, because some people would. And then what would happen? Israel would invade Egypt or would start launching retaliation raids into Egypt. So the Egyptian government doesn't want that. Okay. So really, the main point is Israel simply has always wanted to find a way either to peacefully manage what they call the conflict. It's not a conflict. It's an occupation. But Israel has always wanted to either peacefully manage it with little effort on its part, which is why they pulled out of Gaza in 2005. And at the same time, they want to keep taking as much land as they possibly can, which is what they are doing. And that has accelerated. Not only has it accelerated since Trump became president, but has accelerated since Hamas's attack on October 7th. So now you see, you don't see much in the news about this, but Israeli settlers are going into Palestinian villages and beating people up, threatening them, and leaving blood-soaked dolls with the message, if you don't leave within 24 hours, we'll be back and we're going to kill everybody. And I don't know how many villages they've already ethnically cleansed since October 7th, but I know as of about 10 days ago, it was about 20 villages. And I know that over 130 Palestinians have been murdered, mostly by Israeli settlers. And I just want to point out, they're settlers. They are not soldiers, but they are basically a de facto wing of the Israeli Defense Forces that the government of Israel uses to do their dirty work, to help the government ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. And I even claim that the settlers have a de facto higher rank than the soldiers who protect them. Because when settlers go into a village or Hebron, a city, to intimidate and terrorize settlers, to conduct their pogroms, they're always accompanied by the army. The army is not allowed to interfere with the settlers' activity. The army is there to protect them, and sometimes the soldiers join in the pogroms and the horrible inhumanity that these people just treat Palestinians with, because they're trespassers. Because the Torah, according to many of the settlers, the Torah says that God gave the land to the Jews. Therefore, you are interlopers. You shouldn't be here. Okay. So I'm getting off on a tangent here, but I'm just trying to make the point that Israel has always wanted to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people. It is the main element of the Zionist doctrine that wherever Jews go, anti-Semitism will erupt. So the antidote, as Herzl said, is to spirit the penniless out of the territory. Or as David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, and really you could say the main founder, as Ben-Gurion said, I believe in compulsory transfer. I don't see anything wrong with it. Compulsory transfer being a euphemism for ethnic cleansing.
I think that leads us well into our second point and question. You've written in the article that you always defended Israel from criticism prior to your spiritual awakening. What you discovered was that you were not defending Israel. What were you defending if you were not defending Israel prior to your spiritual awakening?
Well, let me mention in my spiritual awakening, what happened was, it was spontaneous, of course, and I can't go into detail, but I describe it very fully in both of my books. But what happened was, I was reading a book about the Israel-Palestine tragedy, and I was reading about all the things that Israel does that are so inhumane that they do to Palestinians. And as I was reading these things like collective punishment, demolishing homes, even sometimes with people inside the homes, keeping water out of, blocking off water to Palestinian villages, beating people up, letting settlers go into Israel and harass Palestinians, teach their little children to throw stones at Palestinian little children coming home from school. As I was reading this, I was constantly checking the documentation. So in the book that I was reading, there were footnotes, and the footnotes were referencing things like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, which is the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, major organizations, major and reputable organizations. And because the book was footnoting these organizations, I didn't just take the author's word that what he was saying was accurate. I wanted to make sure that what he was saying was not taken out of context or just a lie. So I would go online and find the documents that were cited in the book. And I would then read the paragraphs that the author was taking his quotations from and his information from. And in all cases, the information in the book accurately and impeccably reflected what was in his document, in his source material, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem. So then what happened was, at a certain point, I became overwhelmed with what I was reading, and I put the book down, and I just to take a break. But I want to mention that I had been so absorbed in what I was reading that all these feelings were passing through my body as I was absorbed in my reading. So I was kind of subliminally able to recognize the emotions that were passing through me as I was reading, but I was so focused on what I was reading that the feelings or emotions that came through me were free to come through me. So for example, the first thing I recognized, the first emotion that came up as I'm reading all the horrors that Israel is subjecting the Palestinians to was shock. Shock at what Israel is doing in the name of the Jewish people, in my name. And then that shock turned to anger at Israel for treating people so badly in my name. Then the anger turned inward at me for all the years I had character assassinated the Palestinians, okay, without ever having read anything, just assuming that I was right. And then the anger turned into shame and embarrassment at how stupid I'd been for all these years and how insensitive. And then sorrow for the pain and the plight of the Palestinians at the hands of my people. And then that's when I put the book down and I closed my eyes. And I don't know how long my eyes were closed. All I can say is I went into a darkness, a state where I don't even know that I was even present, where maybe I didn't even exist. But then when I opened my eyes, I noticed that the world looked brighter. Not only did the world look brighter, but I noticed that I felt pure and I felt cleansed and I felt free. And it was so dramatic, this wonderful feeling of wonderment and freedom, that I actually looked around my room and I was in a big room and I looked in the corners of the room where the walls meet. I looked in my bookcase and I'm looking, where's the shock? Where's the anger? Where's the shame, the embarrassment, the sorrow? And I couldn't find any of those emotions at all. So then I just relaxed. I just sat back in my chair and I relaxed into this feeling of wonderment and freedom. And I had no interest in doing anything else. I was not interested in the past and I wasn't interested in the future. I was simply present. And then what happened was I noticed that I couldn't find a Jewish identity. I couldn't find, where is my Jewish identity? And so and I'm summarizing this. I know I'm being a little bit long-winded, but I think people will appreciate this.
Yeah.
I couldn't find a Jewish identity. So what I did was I decided, let me test myself. So now this was in 2006. So I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg. Nick Berg was a young Jewish man who worked in Iraq in 2003. And he was the first person that, whatever they called it, Al-Qaeda of Iraq, I think they called it at the time. He was their first person that they beheaded. And I remember when they beheaded him, and they actually filmed it, although I didn't watch the actual final beheading, but I saw leading up to it where they put the knife to his neck. And he was Jewish, so I could really relate to him because at the time I had the Jewish, I'm not sure what the term is, the Jewish
Self-identification.
I saw myself as a victim. So when I would see Jews being victimized, as usual, as they always have been throughout history, I would see myself in their place. And I knew that was the case. So I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg and imagined myself being there with these ISIS terrorists about to cut my head off, thinking that, okay, I will reanimate my Jewish identity. The horror of that will reanimate it. And there was no horror and there was no reanimation. What happened was a feeling of equanimity arose throughout my body. And I realized without thinking. I didn't think this. It did not come from my mind. My mind was kind of stopped. My mind was absent almost. What happened was I realized that even these terrorists, as bloodthirsty as they are, have the same right to self-determination as do I. And in that moment, I realized this realization arose. Again, it was not a thought. I was as much Palestinian as Israeli, as much Muslim or Christian as Jew or Buddhist or Chinese or whatever. And that's when I recognized my common humanity with everybody. And then what happened was I became filled with psychological insights about what was really happening. And I understood my mind. I understood the collective mind of the Jewish people and also of really anyone when they go into denial and project what they deny onto the other. I understood the dynamic of us against them, which starts with self and other. And then when it becomes more pathological, it becomes us against them. And that's when I realized I had to research the subject more and I had to share what I had discovered with other people. But in recognizing my common humanity with all people, I was relieved of my feeling of victimhood. I no longer identified as a Jew who was a victim, and I was no longer identified as a Jew. So what happened was I realized that I wasn't a Jew, that is just a mental construct, just as Muslim, Christian, American, Israeli, Palestinian, they're all ideas. I'm a human being. I am a human being who happens to have been brought up in a Jewish culture. Okay. Now, if I put my humanity ahead of my separate identity as a Jew, then I'm much more free to acknowledge the wisdom of other cultures. I don't have to be cultic about Judaism and say Judaism is better than everything else. Therefore, you're wrong and I'm right. Therefore, we're entitled to our own country. And even if it means kicking you out of what you thought was your country, I don't have to do all of those inhumane actions because everybody is my brother and my sister. And so I no longer, I'm not pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli. I'm pro-humanity and anti-oppression. And as we have discussed before, the two of us, I oppose anything that is inhumane and I support everything that is humane. And it doesn't matter, and it shouldn't matter what tribe you come from. This tribal thinking is very primitive and it has to stop. And I know I'm going on, but I want to say one more thing. President Biden, Anthony Blinken, Secretary Austin, Defense Secretary, and all the Israelis, they're saying, well, after and Hamas's attack, yes, it was brutal. Though I understand why they did it. I understand all the conditions for decades that led up to this vicious attack. But all of these people, Biden, Blinken, Austin, Netanyahu, they're all saying, well, Israel has a right to defend itself. How is going into Gaza and killing babies defending themselves? If they really wanted to eliminate the reasons why Hamas went into Israel in the first place on October 7th, maybe they would think about making peace. But instead they chose the most primitive response possible, revenge and murder. And they are doing it as usual with no discrimination or very little discrimination between civilians and Hamas members, contrary to what these liars are saying. And by liar, I'm referring to Biden, Blinken, and anybody else who says that that Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields. We've discussed that before in another video, but it's Israel that uses Palestinians as human shields. That's very well documented by Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and Human Rights Watch, and they have found very little evidence that Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields. So, so we have to turn this around because pretty much what most people believe, in fact, what everybody believes who gives their allegiance to Israel, is wrong. It is factually inaccurate. And if there is any truth to it, the truth is taken out of context in order to character assassinate the Palestinian people and exonerate the Israelis of their crimes against humanity.
Thank you, Rich. Why do you think Western media is on the side of Israel? And why do you think Israel's propaganda campaign has been so successful?
Well, first of all, Israel has I wouldn't call it a ministry, but they have an office dedicated to hasbara, propaganda. Number one, they pay lots of kids, college kids on campuses. They pay them to spread Zionist disinformation. They provide people with what they call the hasbara handbook. If for the listeners, if you Google hasbara, HASBARA handbook, you will be able to download it. It's over 100 pages long. I myself have caught a couple people who I discovered were, I mean, they didn't admit it to me, but it was obvious that they were operating on behalf of Israel while making it seem like they were just really devoted to peace and love on both sides of the issue, but they were always injecting something, and I could tell that they were inauthentic. What else? I forget what we were talking about. You got to remind me. At my age,
I was just asking about Western media. It's so
Oh, okay.
parochial.
So first of all, obviously, I was a member of AIPAC, the American Israel Political Affairs Committee, which is the most powerful lobby in the United States. They are, well, 75% of Congress people, when they go, 75% of Congress attends AIPAC conventions, their annual convention. They are cowed by AIPAC. That is why my African American congressman always votes with Israel. He has a terrible rating on Israel. And I've written to him many times. I've said, well, I would think you'd be more sensitive to segregation than most other people. After all, you're an African American. So why do you support segregation of the Palestinian people in Israel and ethnic cleansing? Why are you sacrificing your integrity in order to maintain your status? So if you were honest and supported the Palestinians and opposed segregation, yeah, you'd have a primary challenger in your district. Whoever the Democrat would win the election. The Democrat always win the election in this district, but he would have a primary challenger that AIPAC would be supporting. But the main point is Jewish culture is very infused in America. Many of the largest donors to political campaigns are Jewish. A highly disproportionate number of wealthy Jews contribute to these political campaigns. When Mitt Romney ran in 2012, all 8 of his advisors on the Middle East were Jewish, and they all had dual citizenship. And also the propaganda, the memes that have been disseminated throughout our culture for decades, that Arabs are, they're greedy. They just, have a lot of oil. That the Arabs are terrorists. 9/11 certainly contributed to that quite a bit. With the Saudis who perpetrated 9/11. So it's just our culture is predisposed to believe Israelis and to disbelieve the Arab side of the equation. And it's just really a shame because people refuse to study the history. It's all there. Everything that I believe, that I made every argument that you hear in the media. I made every one of those arguments before I recognized my common humanity with all people. And I can tell you right now that every one of those arguments, as I said earlier, is why most of them were factually wrong, or I took them out of context for nefarious purposes, just to prove myself right.
So I want you to take us through the average Israeli loyalist, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. What is going through their minds as they're seeing the images of Gaza? How are they justifying this?
Let me get back. Okay, so you asked me earlier, and I actually didn't answer the question of, if I wasn't defending Israel, what was I defending? And this applies to them, to any Israeli defender, loyalist, whatever you want to call them. I was not defending Israel. I thought I was. What I was defending, let me put it this way, I was not defending the real Israel. What I was defending were my idealistic images of Israel that I had projected onto the real Israel. Those projections, those idealistic projections, enabled me to deny my role in the oppression of the Palestinian people and to maintain an image of Israel as innocent and decent, because my identity had been fused with Israel. And so when someone criticized Israel, I took it personally. It was as if they were criticizing me. If Israel is inhumane, well, then that means I'm inhumane, and I'm not inhumane. Therefore, the Palestinians are inhumane. So, for example, this happens collectively. The same arguments, I hear them within the Jewish community, even though they were never verbally or taught to us, or even in writing. It's just an internal logic that arises. For example, if someone would say, well, Israel is killing children, they're killing Palestinian children, I would go, no, they're not. They're targeting Arab terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, who have been killing Israelis first, who started it. And they have to go in and try to get rid of these terrorists before they kill more Israelis. And the terrorists are so cynical and so inhumane that they embed themselves in civilian populations, so that when Israel tries to kill them, they accidentally might kill a child or two, and then the terrorists can put the blame on Israel for targeting children, when really it's the terrorists who are responsible. That's what I used to say. That is false. But I hear that all the time, in the media, from my Jewish friends, from non-Jewish friends. That is one of the common misrepresentations. That misrepresentation being that Israel doesn't use human shields, but the Palestinians always use their own people as human shields. It's just the opposite. Almost everything you hear is the opposite, because when people are uneducated about the issue, but they believe what they want to believe, well, what they do is they project their negativity, their feelings of their negative feelings towards Palestinians, their bloodthirst, their lust for their death. They project all that onto the other, because they're denying it within themselves in order to maintain a self-image of themselves as decent, as honest, as fair, and as being not prejudiced. So they project all of that. They deny that they're the opposite. They deny that what they're doing is supporting oppression, and in their denial, they automatically project it unconsciously onto the other, and then blame the other as the cause of any of the problems.
Right. Our listeners might use the term gaslighting for something like that. The other thing that feeds into this is the propaganda. The propaganda gives them the script and the validation to continue. And then the more people that they see that they respect that are falling into the same propaganda, the more they're validated. And so the cycle of propaganda and everything else that you mentioned kind of snowballs
Right.
together.
Also, I can't remember the exact figures, but the Washington Post did a study of how many stories they report of Israelis being harmed by Palestinians, and how many stories they report of Palestinians being harmed by Israelis. And the ratio was something like 1,000 to 1. They'll print 1,000 stories of an Israeli being harmed by a Palestinian before they print one story of a Palestinian being harmed by an Israeli. And as we know, because we study the history, Palestinians are harmed by Israelis every single day. As I mentioned earlier about the settlers, every single day in the West Bank, Palestinians are being harmed by Israelis. It's constant, nonstop. It's a barrage. And imagine if you have to put up with that your entire lifetime, and your parents had to put up with that their entire lifetime. Think of the rage. Think of the rage that is probably being cultivated in Gaza. How many of Gaza's 53% children under age 17. Think of these kids when they grow up. Their parents are dead, their friends are dead, their relatives are dead, their brothers and sisters are dead, some of them, and they're growing up with revenge. What are we going to do against our oppressor, who has kept us living in total poverty for all these years, for my entire life? I haven't even been able to leave this tiny enclave called Gaza, because I am a prisoner here. Think what Israel is doing right now, what they are cultivating. The only way that Israel can stop it, really, and I know they want to do this, and they can't because the world would be so against them, I think. But the only way they could really do it is to totally exterminate pretty much everybody. This is a genocide that is going on. And if the United States didn't have any boundaries, and it has pretty liberal boundaries because they're supporting this genocide, but if the United States had more integrity and didn't want Israel killing, and really didn't want Israel killing innocent civilians, Israel would not be able to get away with what it's doing right now. On the other hand, if the United States had no boundaries, there'd be 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people, in my opinion, that Israel would have killed by now. There'd be no discrimination at all. They would have bombed all the hospitals by now. And you know, it's just too horrible to even think about.
Well, thank you so much, Rich. If you've listened this far, thank you for, listening. And this perspective is so needed. It's unique. If you want to hear more and hear more insights and read more of Rich's research, we linked his book below. You can get it off Amazon. I do want to give Rich the final parting words for us. I'm gonna just give it back to you.
My final parting word, I guess, is if there are any listeners who still believe that, who have the common beliefs that Israel is only defending itself, that the Palestinians are terrorists, study the history. Okay, this is probably, the Israel-Palestine problem is probably the single most researched and documented conflict in world history. Study the history. My books have excellent documentation from mostly Israeli governmental sources. You can check anytime you want. You can check my citations, the source material, but study the history. And there is nothing to fear about discovering that you were wrong. Okay, I was emotionally attached to my belief that Israel was innocent. My Jewish friends are most of them are emotionally attached, and of course, a lot of other people are emotionally attached to believing a certain thing, to believing a certain position, whether it's an Israel-Palestine issue or another completely different issue. Find out the facts. When you realize that you were wrong, it will be a great relief for you. The greatest relief of my life was when I realized that in my prejudice against the Palestinian people and my one-sidedness on behalf of Israel, when I realized how inhumane that attitude was, because I was actually giving my moral support to Israel and allowing Israel, my moral support and the moral support of people like me, combined, our collective moral support made it possible for Israel to occupy and oppress the Palestinian people. Without our moral support, Israel could not have done it. Well, when I realized that my moral support and my inhumanity, that I had been giving moral support for oppression, and that I had been inhumane, that I hadn't been in touch with my humanity, that was the greatest relief of my life. And simultaneously, I reclaimed my common humanity with all people. So I hope I made that fairly clear. Sometimes I'm not that clear, but I think you got it.
I think so too. Thank you so much, Rich. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.